You cannot breathe. A slab of compacted ice, heavy as a collapsed brick ceiling, presses the air from your lungs. It is completely dark. The darkness is not empty. It is a physical, crushing weight pushing relentlessly against your eyelids, your chest, your throat. You try to open your mouth to scream, but freezing snow instantly packs into your mouth and throat, gagging you with a hard, icy plug. The cold does not feel cold. It feels like boiling water poured directly over your bare skin, a searing, violent burn that strips the feeling from your fingers and toes in seconds. You can hear nothing but the frantic, muffled thumping of your own failing heart, a pathetic drumbeat against the unyielding ice. Your ribs groan and bend under the immense tonnage of the avalanche. You are buried alive, entombed in the high Andes, thousands of miles from the warm fires of home. Your husband is somewhere in this black ice, perhaps inches away, perhaps already dead. Your cracked fingernails scrape desperately against the solid wall of frost, inches in front of your face, tearing down to the quick, filling the tiny air pocket with the sharp, metallic smell of your own warm blood. You have less than 2 minutes of oxygen left. Welcome to this simulation. You are stepping into the frozen, heavy boots of history, walking a path where one wrong step, one miscalculation means a quiet, unrecorded death. If you wish to survive this journey and others like it, please subscribe to the channel. Now, close your eyes. Let us rewind the clock to before the ice claimed you. Let us return to where the nightmare truly began. You are sitting in the stifling, oppressive heat of a poorly ventilated London study, months before the mountain would break your life in half. The air in this room is thick, heavily saturated with the pungent, cloying stench of melting beeswax, bitter iron gall ink, and the dry dust of deteriorating parchment. The heat radiating from the brick hearth is practically suffocating, baking the stale sweat into your heavy woolen skirts and multiple layers of undergarments. It makes the skin on your face feel tight, flushed, and uncomfortably dry. Yet despite the roaring fire, a wicked damp draft bleeds through the warped wooden window frames, sending sudden agonizing chills down the back of your neck. You are hunched over a heavy oak table, the wood deeply scarred and stained by years of spilled chemicals and sharp compass points. Your right hand cramps violently, a hot wire of pain shooting from your wrist to your elbow. You have been rhythmically grinding a chunk of raw carbon against a stone mortar for 3 solid hours, reducing it to a fine staining powder for the expedition's ink supply. The soot coats your fingers, works its way deep under your fingernails, and smudges across your cheeks every time you wipe the stinging sweat from your eyes. It tastes bitter and metallic on your lips. This is not a grand adventure yet. It is exhausting, monotonous, manual labor. You look up from the grinding stone, your knuckles aching, and watch the man sitting across the table. He is not looking at you. He is staring through the brass barrel of a massive surveyor's telescope, his hands stained with the same black soot and smelling sharply of machining oil. You watch him meticulously adjust the calibration screws, the cold metal clicking with a harsh, unforgiving precision. The brass gleams in the firelight, but it looks heavy, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. It is a machine designed to measure the indifferent, freezing void of the sky. The table between you is buried under a chaotic, overwhelming layering of topographical charts, shipping manifests, and dense astronomical tables. The maps are massive, aggressive things, covered in jagged, tightly clustered contour lines that depict the savage spine of the South American continent. As you stare at those black lines, a heavy, nauseating knot forms in the pit of your stomach, a physical weight pulling your organs down. You trace the route he has drawn with a thick red grease pencil. It goes up and up into blank white spaces on the heavy paper where the cartographers simply gave up. Those white spaces are not empty. They are the high Andes, a brutal, jagged wasteland of sheer rock and freezing altitude. You feel a creeping dread, a primal animal instinct warning you that drawing neat lines on a piece of paper in a warm room offers absolutely no protection against the reality of a mountain that does not care if you exist. The smell of the sharp oil on the telescope seems to mix with the metallic tang of fear at the back of your throat. You know the stories. You have read the letters from other surveying parties, the ones heavily redacted by the Royal Societies before publication. Letters detailing panicked pack mules slipping off narrow, icy ledges, screaming as they vanished into the mist below. Letters describing grown men coughing up thick black blood as the thin air ruptured their lungs, or freezing to the rock overnight, their bodies left behind because they were simply too solid to chip free with pickaxes. Your husband turns the brass dial again, muttering long strings of numbers under his breath, completely absorbed in the complex math. He is charting the stars, preparing to drag massive glass lenses and heavy iron tripods up into the death zone, all to map constellations that have been dead for 1,000,000 years. You watch his jaw muscles flex, seeing the rigid, immovable obsession taking root in his mind. He is already there, on the mountain. He has already left this stifling room. And you, bound by duty, by law, and by a terrifying, desperate loyalty, are firmly tethered to him. You will follow him into the freezing dark. You wipe your blackened hands on a rough canvas rag, the friction raw against your calluses, and pull another block of hard carbon toward you. You move away from the table, dragging your exhausted legs toward the corner of the room, where the heavy canvas sacks of provisions are stacked like sandbags before a flood. The smell here is entirely different, a nauseating, heavy mix of heavily salted curing pork and the stale, dusty odor of rock-hard biscuit bread. You plunge your raw hands into a sack of the dried meat, feeling the coarse grains of salt strip the remaining moisture from your skin. You are sorting the rations, calculating ounces and pounds against the expected brutal caloric burn of freezing altitudes. The meat is tough, gray, resembling old shoe leather more than food. You know from the grim logs of previous failed expeditions that this unappetizing bulk will eventually become the most precious commodity on Earth, something you would violently kill for when the hunger madness finally sets in. You heft a sack over your shoulder, your spine popping loudly under the sudden dead weight. You drag it across the rough floorboards, the canvas scraping loudly, leaving a faint powdery trail of salt and dust in its wake. Every pound of food you secure in these crates is another pound the miserable mules will have to haul up the narrow, crumbling ledges. If a mule falls, the food is gone. If the food is gone, you die. The mathematics of survival are brutally simple, leaving no room for human error, no margin for bad luck. You return to the table, your back aching with a dull, persistent throb, a sharp headache establishing itself behind your eyes. The air in the room feels even heavier now, stagnant and breathless. You pick up a heavy leather-bound logbook, the thick pages blank and stiff. This is where you will record the data, the exact, meticulous measurements of the stars, assuming your fingers are not too black with frostbite to hold the pen. You run your soot-stained thumb over the rough edge of the paper. It is a terrifying responsibility. You are not a scientist. You are the invisible, sweating infrastructure that makes the science possible. You are the grinder of ink, the packer of heavy crates, the bearer of the crushing logistical weight. You watch your husband again, still locked in his mechanical, silent trance. He is a man who looks at the vast night sky and sees only geometry, angles, and cold equations. He does not see the unblinking hostility of the void. You realize with a sudden chilling clarity that cuts through the heat of the room that he loves the idea of the stars far more than he fears the reality of the mountain. And it is exactly that precise, calculated obsession that will inevitably drag you both to the edge of the world. You begin to clean the delicate glass of the spare telescope lenses, using a scrap of soft yellow chamois cloth. You must remove every microscopic speck of dust, every slight smudge of human oil, or the starlight will fracture and the data will be utterly ruined. You hold the heavy glass up to the firelight, squinting through the thick curve. The heat of the fire distorts the room behind the lens, making the dark shadows on the plaster wall writhe and twist like emaciated, dying figures. The repetitive, circular motion of polishing the glass is hypnotic, but it offers no comfort to your racing mind. Your hands are shaking slightly, a fine, nervous tremor you absolutely cannot control. It is not just the severe physical exhaustion, it is the sheer, overwhelming terror of anticipation. The waiting is a slow, agonizing poison. You almost want the hellish journey to begin just to end the sickening dread of standing on the precipice. You carefully wrap the polished lens in a thick layer of oiled silk, sealing it away from the damp moisture that will soon freeze and crack it if given the slightest chance. The fire pops violently, spitting a glowing, burning cinder onto the dry floorboards. You crush it beneath the heavy leather heel of your boot, smelling the sharp, sudden, acrid smoke of singed wood. The sound of the grinding stone resumes, a harsh, grating scrape that fills the quiet, heavy room. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounds exactly like an iron shovel biting into hard, frozen earth, digging a shallow grave. You try to push the grim thought away, forcing yourself to focus on the sharp pain in your forearm, the gritty texture of the soot under your nails, the oppressive, baking heat of the fire. But the map on the table keeps drawing your exhausted eyes. The thick red line cuts through the ink-drawn mountains like an open, bleeding wound. You are meticulously preparing for a disaster, carefully packing the heavy instruments of your own demise into velvet-lined wooden crates. You wrap the remaining glass lenses in thick wool, binding them tightly with coarse hemp rope, securing them against the violent impacts you know are coming on the trail. The rough rope bites deeply into your raw hands. The brass fittings of the wooden crates are cold and dead to the touch, contrasting sharply with the sweltering heat of the study. Every single item you pack, every heavy vial of ink, every spare compass needle is a tangible, physical weight that must be carried up a vertical wall of rock and ice. As the long night drags on, the roaring fire in the hearth finally begins to die, the tall flames retreating into sullen, pulsing red embers. The temperature in the study drops rapidly, the damp chill from the window finally winning the war against the hearth. You shiver violently, your sweaty, heavy clothes turning instantly clammy and cold against your skin. The sudden, sharp drop in temperature is a harsh physical reminder of exactly what waits for you. It is a microscopic taste of the freezing, endless void you are marching toward. You look at the dark panes of glass in the window, seeing only your own pale, exhausted, soot-stained reflection superimposed over the blackness of the London street. The city outside is loud, full of rattling carriage wheels, shouting drunks and barking dogs. But in your mind, the sounds are already fading, replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence. You were imagining the silence of the high peaks, a silence so profound it rings painfully in your ears, a silence that swallows every spoken word, every scream of pain, every desperate prayer. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the heavy exhaustion wash over you, and in that brief second of darkness, you do not see the warm glow of the dying embers. You see a blinding, terrifying wall of white snow rushing toward you in the dark. You open your eyes with a sharp gasp, your heart hammering painfully against your ribs, the heavy stone pestle slipping from your blackened fingers and clattering loudly against the wooden table. Your husband does not even look up from the telescope. The long, brutal march to the sky has already begun, and there is no turning back.
You are pitched violently forward, the pommel of the heavy leather saddle driving hard into your lower stomach as your pack mule stumbles on the loose, jagged shale. You grip the braided horsehair reins until your raw knuckles turn a bloodless white, your forearms trembling from hours of sustained, terrified tension. The rhythmic, bone-jarring lurch of the animal beneath you is a ceaseless physical assault. Every heavy, deliberate step the mule takes sends a dull shockwave up your rigid spine, settling into a deep, grinding ache at the base of your skull. Your inner thighs are rubbed raw, the coarse wool of your riding skirts grinding the grit and sweat directly into your blistered skin. The stench of the exhausted beast is thick and inescapable, a heavy, sour cloud of hot animal sweat, wet hair, and fear that completely overwhelms the thin mountain air. You watch the mule's ragged ears flick back and forth, listening to the treacherous terrain, its massive chest heaving with wet, rattling gasps. The animal knows, just as your own primitive instincts know, that you do not belong up here. You are a slow-moving, fragile target dragging yourselves up a vertical wall of dead gray rock, entirely at the mercy of gravity and slipping hooves. The trail you are following is barely a trail at all. It is a harsh, narrow gouge cut into the sheer, unforgiving face of the Andes, no wider than the span of your two arms. To your left, a solid wall of granite rises straight up, scraping against the bruised, iron-gray sky. To your right, there is absolutely nothing. You make the mistake of looking down. The valley floor is already swallowed by a thick, bruised blanket of storm clouds thousands of feet below, a churning abyss that offers no visual bottom, only the terrifying promise of a long, screaming fall. Vertigo hits you like a physical blow to the back of the knees. The world tilts sickeningly, your vision swimming with dark spots as an overwhelming, nauseating panic floods your veins. You violently force your gaze back to the bloodied hind legs of the mule directly in front of you, focusing entirely on the rhythmic, hypnotic swing of its coarse tail. You must shrink your entire universe down to the 3 feet of shattered rock immediately ahead. Looking anywhere else invites a paralyzing terror that will freeze your hands on the reins and send you tumbling over the edge. The air here feels wrong. It is thin, brittle, and entirely devoid of substance. You open your mouth and drag in massive, desperate gulps, but it feels like you are suffocating in a vacuum. Your lungs burn with a sharp, dry heat, your chest heaving violently, but the oxygen simply is not there. The effort of simply staying conscious makes your vision blur at the edges, a dull, rhythmic pounding establishing itself firmly behind your eyes.
Ahead of you, the line of the expedition stretches upward like a string of condemned prisoners marching to the gallows. You watch your husband, riding near the front behind the indigenous guides. His posture is rigid, uncompromising, his heavy wool coat pulled tight against the bitter wind. He does not look back. He is staring upwards, his gaze fixed permanently on the invisible summit, driven by a cold, calculating obsession that renders him completely immune to the suffering around him. Strapped precariously to the backs of the struggling mules between you are the heavy wooden crates you packed in the sweltering heat of London. The long brass cylinders of the telescopes, the fragile glass lenses, the heavy iron tripods, the dense leather-bound astronomical tables, they all represent a massive, crushing weight that is actively killing the animals. You listen to the sharp, terrifying crack of a wooden crate scraping against the granite wall as a mule takes a corner too tightly. The sound echoes flatly in the thin air. You know exactly what is inside that crate. You know the exact mathematical value of the brass gears, the precise thickness of the glass. You realize with a sudden sinking clarity that if the animal slips and falls, your husband will mourn the loss of the optical instruments far more than the life of the beast, or perhaps even the lives of the men driving them. The expedition is a massive, crawling machine, and you are simply another functioning part, utterly expendable in the face of the data. The transition from the humid green valleys below to this sterile, freezing wasteland was a slow, agonizing suffocation. As you climb higher, the vibrant colors of the living world simply bleed away, replaced by a monotonous, oppressive palette of dead gray slate, rust-colored iron deposits, and the blinding, hostile white of the upper snowfields. The temperature is plummeting with every 100 feet of elevation gained. The sun above is a harsh, blinding white disk that offers absolutely no heat. Its light reflects off the sharp mica in the rocks, stabbing into your unprotected eyes like fine glass needles, causing them to water and freeze at the corners of your lashes. The wind is changed from a steady draft to a violent physical force. It rips across the jagged peaks with a flat, mechanical roar, carrying microscopic shards of ice that scour the exposed skin of your cheeks like coarse sandpaper.
You pull your thick woolen scarf tightly over your nose and mouth, breathing in the damp, sour smell of your own recycled breath. The heavy layers of clothing that stifled you at sea level are now entirely insufficient. The cold is not a weather condition, it is a predator. It actively probes for weaknesses in your garments, slipping icy fingers down the collar of your coat, seeking the warm blood in your neck and chest. You can no longer feel your toes inside your leather boots. They have become heavy, dead blocks of wood, entirely unresponsive to your commands.
The silence of the high altitude is not peaceful. It is a heavy, oppressive absence of sound that presses painfully against your eardrums. In the valleys, there was the constant, chaotic noise of life, the rushing of rivers, the screaming of insects, the wind rustling through dense foliage. Here, the world has been stripped bare of anything organic. The only sounds left are the harsh, mechanical noises of your own slow destruction. You hear the rhythmic, desperate scraping of iron horseshoes fighting for purchase on loose shale. You hear the wet, violent snorting of the mules as they fight for oxygen. You hear the agonizing creak of dry leather stretching under the immense weight of the brass instruments. And beneath it all, you hear the terrifying, random clatter of falling rock. Every time a pebble breaks loose from the cliff face above and ricochets down the slope, the entire line of riders freezes in a state of absolute paralyzed dread. You hold your breath, your muscles locking tight, waiting for the small rattle to escalate into the deafening roar of a rock slide that will sweep you all into the void. When the pebble finally drops away into the gray mist below without triggering a catastrophe, you exhale a shaky, ragged breath, the metallic taste of adrenaline thick and sour on the back of your tongue. You were existing in a state of constant, unbearable anticipation, your nervous system frayed and snapping under the prolonged exposure to imminent death. The afternoon begins to die, the harsh white light bleeding out of the sky and leaving behind a bruised, sickly purple twilight. The temperature drops another 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, a sudden brutal shock to your already freezing system. The trail ahead narrows even further, forcing the mules to walk dangerously close to the crumbling lip of the precipice. You hit the snow line. It is not the soft, powdery snow of a winter field. It is ancient, compacted ice, scarred and pitted by the savage winds, dirty with blown rock dust. The mule's hooves slip violently on a patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. The animal whinnies in sudden terror, its heavy body slamming hard against the granite wall, pinning your right leg between the saddle and the rock. A sharp, blinding pain shoots up your femur, so intense it forces a short, pathetic gasp from your frozen lips. You cannot cry out. You cannot stop the line. You simply grit your teeth until you taste copper, waiting for the beast to regain its footing. It scrambles desperately, its iron shoes sparking against the hidden rock before finally stabilizing with a heavy, shuddering heave. You pull your crushed leg away from the wall, the muscles throbbing with a deep, sickening ache. You are completely alone in your pain. You look up at the towering peaks surrounding you, their jagged silhouettes cutting sharp, black shapes out of the fading sky. They are entirely indifferent to your exhaustion, your pain, your freezing fingers, and your desperate need for oxygen. They are massive, silent monuments to geological violence, and you are nothing but a microscopic parasite crawling painfully across their skin. As the last of the daylight vanishes, plunging the narrow pass into absolute freezing darkness, the realization of your total isolation settles into your bones like a heavy lead weight. There is no rescue coming. There is no warm hearth waiting. You are miles above the world of the living, suspended in a frozen, breathless purgatory, marching slowly and inevitably toward a destination made entirely of ice and stars. You slump forward, burying your freezing face into the coarse, foul-smelling mane of the mule, and close your eyes against the terrifying void, letting the agonizing, rhythmic lurch of the animal carry you deeper into the dark. You are no longer climbing. The brutal, rhythmic upward lurch of the mules has finally stopped, replaced by a sudden, terrifying stillness that feels entirely wrong to your battered body. You have reached the summit camp, a flat, barren plateau of shattered gray granite and deep, hard-packed snow suspended miles above the breathable world.
There is no triumph here, no surge of victorious adrenaline. There is only the crushing, immediate reality of severe hypoxia. You slide down from the wooden saddle, and your legs instantly buckle beneath you, devoid of any strength or sensation. You hit the frozen earth hard, your knees absorbing the violent shock, but you barely feel the impact. You are suffocating in the open air. Your chest heaves in massive, desperate spasms, trying to drag oxygen out of a vacuum, but the air is incredibly thin, dry, and bitterly abrasive. It scrapes down your throat like inhaled glass, offering absolutely no nourishment to your screaming lungs. You taste copper and old dust. The mules around you are collapsing onto their sides, their flanks heaving with wet, rattling groans, their eyes rolling back in their heavy skulls. They are dying by degrees, and as you spit a mouthful of thick, blood-tinged saliva onto the permafrost, you realize you are too. The survival clock has not stopped. It has simply accelerated. You force yourself to your feet, your muscles screaming in protest, your joints stiff and grinding without lubrication. The sun is dropping rapidly behind the jagged spine of the western peaks, and with its disappearance comes a temperature plunge so violent it feels like a physical blow to the chest. The sweat that has soaked through your heavy woolen undergarments during the agonizing ascent begins to freeze instantly against your skin, turning your clothes into a rigid, icy cage. You must move, or you will simply stiffen and die where you stand. The expedition men, moving like sluggish, exhausted phantoms in the fading gray light, begin dragging the massive bundles of canvas from the backs of the prone animals. You join them, your numb fingers fumbling uselessly at the frozen hemp knots. You finally manage to pry a rope loose, the rough fibers tearing the blistered skin from your palms, leaving raw, weeping wounds that you cannot even feel. You grab a fistful of the heavy, oil-treated canvas and pull. It does not fold or billow. The freezing air has turned the thick fabric as rigid and unyielding as a sheet of iron.
Raising the observatory tent is a chaotic, brutal war against the elements. The wind up here does not blow, it violently assaults. It screams across the plateau with a deafening, continuous roar, tearing at the stiff canvas, trying desperately to rip it from your bleeding hands and hurl it into the black abyss below. You throw your entire exhausted body weight against the fabric, pinning it to the ice with your chest and shoulders, while your husband and a guide swing heavy iron mallets, driving massive steel pitons deep into the frozen bedrock. The sound of metal striking metal is a sharp, agonizing crack that cuts through the howling wind, vibrating painfully in your hollow teeth. Every swing of the mallet requires a monumental, oxygen-depleted effort. You watch a guide miss the piton, the heavy hammer glancing off the iron and smashing directly into his own knee. He collapses without a sound, his face contorted in a silent scream, unable to spare the breath to vocalize his agony. You do not stop to help him. You cannot. If you let go of the canvas, the wind will take the tent, and without the tent, every single one of you will be frozen solid before midnight. You dig your deadened toes into the ice, lean your weight harder against the freezing fabric, and close your eyes against the stinging, blown grit. When the massive canvas dome is finally erected, secured by a web of taut, freezing ropes, you crawl inside through the narrow flap. The interior is not warm, but the sudden cessation of the violent wind is a jarring, deafening relief. The air inside smells sharply of heavy machine oil, damp wool, raw canvas, and the sour, unwashed stench of desperate human bodies. It is a fragile, dark bubble of stagnant air in a hostile void. Your husband does not rest. He is already prying the lids off the heavy wooden crates you packed in the sweltering heat of London, his movements jerky, frantic, and driven by a terrifying, singular obsession. He completely ignores his own violently shivering frame. You watch him reach into the velvet-lined box and pull out the massive brass barrel of the primary telescope. The metal is utterly pristine, gleaming dully in the dim light of a single sputtering oil lantern, a stark, alien intrusion in this filthy, desperate environment. You know exactly how cold that brass is. You know that if you touch it with a bare hand, the moisture in your skin will instantly freeze to the metal, welding your flesh to the instrument and tearing it away when you pull back. You pull on a pair of thick, coarse goatskin gloves, the stiff leather hindering your already clumsy, frost-nipped fingers. You move to assist him, becoming a silent, mechanical extension of his will. The assembly of the equatorial mount is a grueling, agonizing puzzle of heavy iron gears and delicate calibration screws. You hold the massive dead weight of the iron tripod legs steady, your spine groaning under the strain, while he violently wrestles the brass housing into place. The cold radiates from the metal, sinking directly through your leather gloves and deep into your aching bones. Your fingers are clumsy, numb blocks of wood. You drop a heavy steel locking bolt. It hits the frozen ground with a sharp clatter and rolls into the dark shadows of the canvas wall. Panic, hot and nauseating spikes in your chest. If that bolt is lost, the telescope cannot be stabilized. If the telescope cannot be stabilized, the entire agonizing journey, the dying mules, the bleeding hands, the agonizing hypoxia, all of it was for absolutely nothing. You drop to your knees in the dirt, blindly sweeping your numb gloved hands over the jagged freezing ice, your breath misting thickly in the lantern light. You find it, your thick gloves scraping against the cold steel, and you hand it up to him. He does not thank you. He does not even look at you. He simply snatches the bolt, his eyes fixed permanently on the complex mechanics of the brass beast. Finally, he carefully unpacks the massive objective lens, wrapped in its protective layers of oiled silk and wool. You hold your breath, your heart hammering a weak, frantic rhythm against your ribs. This is the eye of the expedition. The glass is incredibly thick, perfectly ground, and terrifyingly fragile. You watch his shaking, frost-bitten hands slowly insert the heavy lens into the brass housing. One slight slip, one uncontrollable spasm of his freezing muscles, and the glass will shatter on the permafrost, ending the mission instantly. The silence in the tent is absolute, broken only by the ragged, wheezing breaths of the exhausted crew outside and the relentless, dull roar of the wind battering the canvas walls. He tightens the final brass retaining ring with a sickening scrape of metal on metal. The machine is complete. It dominates the center of the dark tent, a heavy, cold monument to human arrogance and mathematical precision, pointing blindly upward at the canvas ceiling. Your husband roughly shoves the canvas roof flap open, exposing the interior of the observatory directly to the brutal, freezing vacuum of the night sky. The temperature inside the tent instantly plummets, extinguishing the small, pitiful warmth you had managed to generate with your own body heat. He peers through the small finder scope, his face pressed tightly against the freezing metal, muttering a rapid, continuous stream of calculations. He twists the heavy brass knobs, the gears grinding loudly, adjusting the massive barrel by microscopic fractions of an inch. You stand behind him, shivering so violently your teeth audibly chatter, your arms wrapped tightly around your own chest in a futile attempt to retain heat. You are completely exhausted, starved of oxygen, and slowly freezing to death, but you cannot look away. You are caught in the powerful, inescapable gravity of his obsession. He suddenly stops moving. His hands drop from the brass knobs. He takes a slow, shaky step back from the eyepiece, his chest heaving. He turns to you in the gloom, his face a pale, gaunt mask of frost and sharp angles. He does not speak, but he gestures rigidly toward the telescope. You step forward, your boots crunching loudly on the frozen earth. You hesitate for a fraction of a second, terrified of what you might see, terrified of the cold metal, terrified of the vast, crushing emptiness above. Then you lean in and press your eye against the small glass lens. The shock of it forces a sharp gasp from your throat. You expected to see the sky, but you do not. You see a terrifying, blinding density of light. The atmosphere up here is so agonizingly thin, so devoid of moisture and dust, that the stars do not twinkle or shimmer.
They are hard, piercing, unblinking points of absolute brilliance scattered across a void so black it feels like a physical substance. They look like millions of shards of crushed, glowing glass embedded deep in a thick mantle of black velvet. They are incredibly, violently close. You feel a sudden horrifying wave of vertigo, as if the ground has vanished beneath your feet and you are falling upward into that freezing, infinite maw. The sheer scale of the universe you are looking at is not beautiful. It is an oppressive, crushing weight that instantly reduces you, your husband, and your agonizing struggle to a state of complete microscopic insignificance. You can see the dense, glowing dust of the Milky Way, a massive, silent river of dead light cutting across the dark. You are staring directly into the ancient, freezing machinery of the cosmos.
You slowly pull away from the lens, the cold brass leaving a stinging red ring around your eye. You look at your husband. He is already reaching for the heavy leather logbook and the carbon ink you ground for him in that sweltering, distant room in London. His pen begins to scratch frantically across the stiff paper, translating the terrifying majesty of the infinite void into neat, manageable columns of cold numbers. You sit down on an empty wooden crate, the chill seeping instantly through your heavy wool skirts. You look up through the open canvas flap, staring at the naked, brutal sky with your bare eyes. The awe is there, a heavy, resonant thrumming in your chest, but it is inextricably chained to a deep, primal terror. You have achieved the impossible. You have dragged yourselves to the very roof of the world to map the heavens. But as you sit in the freezing, dark belly of the canvas tent, listening to the violent wind scream across the plateau and the deep, unsettling groans of the ancient ice settling beneath your feet, a cold realization settles in your gut. You have trespassed into a domain that aggressively hates human life. The mountain allowed you to climb its spine. It allowed you to build your fragile canvas bubble, but the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the summit whispers a terrifying truth. You belong to the ice now.
You are lying in the absolute freezing darkness of the canvas tent, wrapped tightly in two thick, coarse wool blankets that feel entirely inadequate against the severe drop in temperature. Sleep at this altitude is not restful. It is a desperate, fragmented clinging to consciousness. Your body is utterly exhausted, your muscles twitching with lingering lactic acid, but your brain refuses to shut down in the oxygen-starved environment. Every time you drift toward the edge of sleep, your body violently jolts you awake with a sudden, terrifying gasp for air, convinced it is suffocating. The air inside the small sleeping quarters is stale, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of the oil lantern that died hours ago. Beside you, your husband breathes in an erratic, jagged rhythm, his chest pausing for terrifyingly long seconds before sucking in a harsh, rattling wheeze. The wind outside has not stopped. It batters the heavy canvas walls with a relentless mechanical rhythm, the fabric snapping and popping like distant rifle fire. You stare up into the pitch black, your eyes aching, feeling the oppressive weight of the miles of empty sky pressing down on the fragile roof of your shelter. The freezing cold has bypassed your skin entirely. It is settled deep in your marrow, a dull, throbbing ache that makes your joints feel brittle and old. You are suspended in a miserable, freezing purgatory, waiting for a dawn that feels entirely hypothetical. It does not start with a sound. It starts with a vibration. You feel it first in the deep, aching bones of your spine, where you press against the frozen earth. It is a low, subsonic rumble, a sickening tremor that travels through the granite bedrock directly into your teeth. Your eyes snap wide open in the dark. The relentless howling of the wind suddenly seems to cut out, replaced by a strange, unnatural vacuum, a terrifying pressure drop that makes your ears pop painfully. You sit up, the cold air instantly biting at your exposed face. You reach out a numb hand to shake your husband's shoulder, your throat tight with a sudden primal panic. Before your fingers can even touch the rough wool of his coat, the vibration escalates into a deafening, catastrophic roar. It sounds like the mountain itself is being violently ripped in half, a grinding mechanical screech of millions of tons of ancient ice and rock shearing away from the peak above. The sound is so physically massive it knocks the breath out of your lungs. It is not falling snow. It is a moving, solid wall of destruction hurtling down the 60-degree slope directly toward your fragile canvas bubble. There is absolutely no time to stand, no time to scream, no time to even process the scale of the impending violence.
The impact is a spectacular, blinding explosion of kinetic energy. The avalanche does not gently bury the camp, it obliterates it. The massive wall of compacted ice, shattered slate, and heavy snow slams into the windward side of the tent with the force of a speeding train. The heavy iron pitons you spend hours driving into the permafrost are sheared off instantly with a sharp metallic shriek. The thick, oil-treated canvas does not tear, it violently ruptures, exploding inward under the crushing pressure. You are instantly thrown from your makeshift bed, hit by a concussive shockwave that shatters the fragile wooden crates and bends the heavy brass tripod of the telescope like cheap tin. You are caught in a violent, chaotic tumble of heavy debris, jagged rock, and freezing white violence. Up and down instantly lose all meaning. You are violently spun, crushed, and thrown, the coarse wool of your blankets tangling around your limbs, binding you tight as the moving mountain drags you down the slope. The friction of the moving snow generates a sudden, terrifying heat against your skin, even as the ice forces its way down your collar and into your boots. You squeeze your eyes shut, your hands flying to protect your head and neck as heavy, unseen objects batter your ribs and shoulders. The noise is absolute, a crushing physical pressure inside your skull that drowns out the snapping of your own bones. Just as suddenly as the violent motion began, it abruptly stops. The terrifying roar of the moving avalanche instantly cuts out, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The immediate aftermath of an avalanche is not soft. When the massive momentum of the moving snow halts, the immense friction instantly melts and refreezes the ice crystals, setting the debris around you like fast-drying concrete. You are locked completely in place, suspended at an awkward, agonizing angle. Your right arm is pinned violently behind your back, the shoulder joint screaming in protest, while your left leg is twisted painfully beneath the heavy, unseen bulk of what feels like a destroyed wooden crate. You are buried alive. The absolute darkness presses against your eyelids with a physical, crushing weight. You try to open your mouth to draw a desperate breath, to scream for your husband, but the compacted snow is packed tightly around your face. It fills your mouth, gagging you with a hard, freezing plug of ice and rock dust. You panic. It is a wild, animalistic terror that floods your system with adrenaline, making your heart hammer frantically against your bruised ribs. You violently thrash your body, trying to break the concrete grip of the ice, but you cannot move a single inch. The tomb is absolute and unyielding.
The heavy, compacted snow presses the air from your lungs, a slow, mechanical crushing of your chest cavity. Every time you manage to exhale a tiny, precious fraction of your remaining air, the heavy ice shifts microscopically, filling the void and constricting your ribs even further. You are suffocating in the dark, thousands of miles from the warm fires of home. The cold is no longer a localized ache, it is a rapid systemic failure. It feels like boiling water poured directly into your veins, a searing, violent burn that strips the feeling from your extremities in seconds as your body desperately pulls all remaining blood to your core. You cannot hear the wind anymore. You cannot hear the shifting ice. The only sound left in the universe is the frantic, muffled thumping of your own failing heart, a pathetic drumbeat against the unyielding ice. Your cracked fingernails scrape desperately against the solid wall of frost inches in front of your face, tearing down to the quick, filling the tiny air pocket with the sharp metallic smell of your own warm blood. You realize with a slow, sickening clarity that the oxygen is almost gone. The grand expedition, the meticulous calculations, the beautiful brass telescope, none of it matters in the dark. You are simply another piece of organic debris swallowed by the mountain, waiting for the cold to finish its work. The pressure on your chest does not ease, but the mountain shifts. It is a microscopic, violent adjustment of the massive debris field, a deep structural groan that vibrates through the compacted ice, suffocating you. The solid wall of frost inches from your face cracks. A fissure no wider than a piece of twine opens directly above your mouth, and a thin, razor-sharp draft of freezing air drops into your tiny, blood-scented pocket. You suck it in with a frantic, animalistic gasp. The air is so agonizingly cold it feels like inhaling powdered glass, searing your throat and triggering a violent, involuntary coughing fit. The spasm racks your crushed ribs, sending blinding flares of white-hot pain through your torso, but the mechanical action of coughing forces your body to fight. Adrenaline, thick and metallic, floods your dying system. You shove your right hand upward, your torn, bleeding fingernails scraping uselessly against the ice until you find the narrow fissure. You jam your fingers into the crack and pull. You do not feel the skin shear off your knuckles. You do not feel the hypothermic sluggishness in your joints. You pull with the hysterical, localized strength of a drowning rat, tearing chunks of fast-freezing snow away, widening the hole millimeter by millimeter until the blinding, terrible light of the high-altitude sun suddenly stabs into your retinas. You violently drag your upper body through the narrow vertical shaft you have carved, your shoulders scraping against the jagged ice. You breach the surface, collapsing face first onto the blinding white crust of the snowpack. You cannot stand. You cannot even push yourself up on your elbows. You simply lie there, vomiting thin yellow bile onto the pristine snow, your lungs expanding and contracting in massive, desperate heaves. The air is still impossibly thin, offering no real nourishment, but you are no longer drowning in the dark. As the black spots slowly fade from your vision, the harsh, unforgiving reality of the morning comes into terrifying focus. The violent, screaming wind of the night before has completely vanished, leaving behind a silence so absolute and profound it creates a high-pitched physical ringing in your ears. You force your head up, squinting against the excruciating glare of the sun reflecting off the ice. The plateau is gone. The carefully chosen, flat expanse of gray granite where you built your canvas sanctuary has been entirely erased. In its place is a massive, chaotic scar of deep, churned snow and shattered rock, sloping aggressively toward the abyss. The tent, the heavy wooden crates, the thick hemp ropes, everything has been swallowed by the white. You force yourself to your knees, your wet, frozen woolen skirts cracking loudly like breaking timber. Your body is a map of localized agony. Your left collarbone grinds with a sickening click every time you shift your weight, and your right boot is packed with a slurry of freezing snow and what you coldly realize is your own blood from the crush of the saddle earlier. You begin to crawl. You move like a broken insect over the jagged, uneven surface of the avalanche debris, your raw hands leaving bright red smears on the white ice. You are looking for the dark shapes of the survivors, for any break in the monotonous, blinding white. You see a patch of dark, oiled canvas protruding from a compacted mound of snow 10 yards away. You drag yourself toward it, your breath tearing through your throat in ragged, wet rasps. You begin to dig with your bare, bleeding hands, frantically throwing aside chunks of ice heavy as concrete. You uncover a boot, then a leg wrapped in torn, freezing wool. It is one of the indigenous guides. You grab him by the frozen fabric of his coat and pull with the last reserves of your strength, dragging his torso free from the snow. His eyes are open, staring blankly at the harsh blue sky. His skin is a dull, bruised blue, and his mouth is packed solidly with ice. He is already rigid. You drop his heavy coat, the fabric hitting the snow with a dull thud, and you keep crawling. A few yards away, the snowpack heaves. A hand clad in a thick, coarse goatskin glove punches through the crust. You drag yourself over the debris, your bruised ribs screaming, and begin tearing at the ice around the glove. You uncover the back of a familiar wool coat. It is your husband. You dig with a desperate, frantic energy, your torn fingernails catching on the rough fabric as you pull the heavy snow away from his head and shoulders. He gasps violently as his face clears the ice, his eyes wild and completely unseeing in the harsh light. You grab his shoulders, trying to pull him completely free, but he violently shoves your hands away. He is not looking at you. He is not checking you for injuries. He is scrambling frantically to his feet, his boots slipping on the slick ice, his head swiveling erratically as he surveys the devastated plateau. You watch his face, a gaunt, frost-bitten mask of absolute horror, as he realizes the scope of the destruction. He is not looking for the other guides. He is not looking for the mules. He is staring at the smooth, unbroken white expanse where the heavy brass telescope and the delicate glass lenses should be. His entire world, his singular, calculating obsession, has been violently erased by the mountain. He drops to his knees in the snow, his hands digging aimlessly into the permafrost, a low, guttural sound tearing from his throat that sounds nothing like a human voice.
You leave him to his frantic, useless digging and turn your attention to the most terrifying equation of all, the survival mathematics. You force himself to stand, swaying dangerously in the thin air, your broken collarbone screaming. You must find the provisions. You begin to walk the edge of the avalanche path, your eyes scanning the blinding white for the heavy canvas sacks of salted pork, the wooden crates of hard biscuit, the essential fuel that will keep your internal organs from shutting down in the freezing temperatures. You trace the trajectory of the slide, following the deep gouges in the snow where heavy objects were dragged down the mountain. The path leads directly to the sheer, jagged edge of the precipice. You walk to the lip, the vertigo instantly washing over you, and look down. The massive, churning cloud of storm clouds that obscured the valley yesterday has cleared, revealing a terrifying vertical drop of thousands of feet. There, scattered across a narrow, unapproachable ledge nearly half a mile below, are the dark, broken shapes of the expedition's pack mules. They are shattered, twisted ruins, completely unreachable. Surrounding them are the splintered remains of the wooden crates, their contents violently ejected and lost forever in the deep crevices of the granite. You back away from the edge, your legs giving out beneath you. You collapse onto the hard ice, a cold, heavy dread settling into the very marrow of your bones. It is a physical sensation, a slow-moving poison that paralyzes your thoughts. You are stranded at 10,000 feet above sea level. The temperature will plunge back to lethal extremes the moment the sun drops behind the peaks. You have no shelter, no heavy canvas to block the violent wind that will inevitably return. You have no fire, no dry wood, no means of melting the snow for water. But worst of all, you have absolutely 0 calories. The salted pork, the heavy biscuits, the rations you meticulously weighed and packed in the sweltering heat of London are all resting at the bottom of an unscalable abyss. Your body, already exhausted and battered by the climb and the avalanche, will soon begin to cannibalize its own muscle tissue simply to keep your heart beating in the freezing void. You look down at your bloody, numb hands resting on the stark white snow. You are wearing a torn wool coat, wet undergarments, and frozen leather boots. That is the entirety of your inventory against the Andes. The realization does not bring tears. The air is far too dry, and your body is already ruthlessly conserving moisture. Instead, it brings a slow, heavy, suffocating silence. The violent disaster of the avalanche is over, but the true, agonizing process of dying has only just begun. You are sealed inside a grave of your own making. The makeshift snow cave you and the survivors plowed out of the avalanche debris is not a shelter. It is merely a delay. You are packed together in a space no larger than a root cellar, the curved ceiling of packed ice looming mere inches from your face. The air inside is atrocious, a stagnant, suffocating miasma of wet, rotting wool, unwashed skin, sour breath, and the sharp metallic odor of slow necrosis. The entrance to your burrow is blocked by a heavy pack saddle salvaged from the wreckage, sealing you away from the screaming wind outside, but trapping the freezing, humid air of your own exhalations within. The walls of the cave are coated in a thick, glittering layer of hoarfrost, formed entirely from the moisture leaving your dying bodies.
Every time you exhale, you are literally breathing your life into the ice, watching it harden against the walls. You cannot stretch your legs, you cannot sit up straight. You are locked in a rigid fetal position, your knees drawn tightly to your bruised chest in a desperate, pathetic attempt to conserve whatever microscopic fraction of body heat remains in your core. You're shivering so violently that your jaw aches, your teeth clicking together with a rapid mechanical rhythm that you cannot stop, no matter how hard you bite down on your own numb tongue. It is day 4, or perhaps it is day 5. The concept of linear time has frozen solid and shattered. In the absolute suffocating darkness of the snow cave, there are no hours, only the agonizing, drawn-out increments of your own physical decay. The hunger is no longer a simple ache or a sharp cramp. It has evolved into a localized, burning agony that dominates your entire consciousness. Your stomach has completely collapsed in on itself, the caustic digestive acids gnawing violently at your own internal lining. It feels as though you have swallowed a handful of jagged, heated rocks that are slowly grinding together just beneath your ribcage. But the sharp pain of the stomach is nothing compared to the deep, systemic exhaustion of true starvation. Your body, desperate for fuel in the freezing environment, has begun to violently cannibalize itself. You can physically feel the muscle tissue in your thighs and shoulders wasting away, dissolving into the bloodstream to keep your heart pumping a few more sluggish beats. Lifting your arm to brush a falling flake of frost from your cheek requires a monumental, conscious effort, an exhausting marshalling of caloric energy that leaves you gasping for breath in the thin, dead air. You are surrounded by millions of tons of frozen water, yet you are dying of thirst. You know the brutal survival rule. Eating raw snow will plummet your core temperature and kill you in an hour. So you pack tiny, dirty shards of ice into a small leather pouch and press it against your bare collarbone, waiting agonizingly for your fading body heat to melt it into a few drops of gritty, life-sustaining liquid. Beside you, pressed so tightly against your side that you share the exact same rhythm of violent shivering, is your husband. The man who charted the skies with mathematical precision is completely gone, replaced by a gaunt, unresponsive husk. His face, illuminated only by the faint, sickly blue light that filters through the ice ceiling during the daylight hours, is a terrifying mask of sharp angles and deep, blackened hollows. The frostbite on his cheeks and nose has turned the tissue into necrotic, waxy yellow. He does not speak to you. He does not offer comfort or apologize for dragging you into this frozen hell. His mind, unable to process the total collapse of his grand expedition, has simply fractured. He spends the endless dark hours muttering disjointed, rapid-fire streams of astronomical data, his cracked lips barely moving. Right ascension, declination, azimuth, zenith. The words are a meaningless, ghostly static in the cramped space. Sometimes his freezing, rigid fingers reach up to the low ceiling of the ice cave, weakly tracing invisible contour lines and star charts onto the frost. He is still mapping. He is mapping the ceiling of his own tomb. You watch his hand fall back to his chest, lacking the energy to hold it aloft, and you feel absolutely nothing. The capacity for empathy, for anger, for marital devotion has been entirely burned away by the cold. You are simply two dying organisms sharing the same inadequate pocket of air. As the days bleed seamlessly into the endless, freezing nights, the severe hypoxia and advanced starvation finally break down the barrier between waking reality and the dreaming void. The sensory deprivation of the dark cave becomes a canvas for your failing brain. At first, it is only auditory hallucinations. You hear the sharp, distinct clicking of the brass telescope gears right next to your ear. You hear the heavy, plodding crunch of mule hooves on the shale, a sound so incredibly real you weakly turn your head, expecting to see the beast standing in the corner of the ice cave. But soon, the darkness itself begins to texturize and tear. The absolute blackness of the burial mound is slowly replaced by a deep, velvety indigo. You stare at the packed ice inches from your nose, and it begins to dissolve. The claustrophobic walls fall away, and you are suddenly staring upward into the infinite, terrifying depth of the Andean night sky. The air in the cave does not warm, but the oppressive ceiling is gone. You are lying on your back, completely exposed to the cosmos. The stars do not remain in the sky. As you watch, your breath shallow and ragged, the constellations you traveled thousands of miles to observe begin to violently detach themselves from the firmament. They fall, slowly, silently, like heavy, glowing flakes of phosphorus. The stars drift down into the cramped space of the snow cave. You watch the brilliant, burning cross of the southern hemisphere descend directly toward you, the light harsh and completely devoid of warmth. They are not balls of burning gas. They are cold, intricate machines made of the same heavy brass and polished glass as the lost telescope. They hover in the stale air, illuminating the horrific sunken faces of the survivors huddled around you in a sickly, ethereal glow. You reach out a trembling, frost-blackened finger to touch a massive floating star that is severed near your knee. Your fingertip meets only the hard, unyielding wall of the ice cave. The vision ripples and warps, the brilliant brass mechanics dissolving back into the dirty, frozen moisture of your own breath. The crushing, claustrophobic reality of the snowpack violently reasserts itself, pressing down on your chest with doubled weight. The transition from the infinite sky back to the suffocating ice triggers a silent, tearing sob in your throat, a dry heave of absolute, unadulterated despair. On the sixth night, the rhythm of the misery changes. The indigenous guide huddled on your left side, a man whose name you realize you never actually learned, stops shivering. For days, his violent, rhythmic shaking has been a constant, abrasive friction against your own shoulder. The sudden cessation of movement is startling in the dark. It is not a peaceful stillness. It is the heavy, rigid stillness of an object that has ceased to generate any internal friction. You do not hear him gasp for a final breath. You do not hear a death rattle. The process of freezing to death is terrifyingly quiet. The core temperature simply drops below the critical threshold. The heart slows to a crawl, and the brain quietly shuts down the electrical signals. You lie there in the pitch black, listening intently over the sound of your own jagged breathing. There is nothing. You know he is dead, not because of any dramatic climax, but simply because the space he occupies in the tight huddle slowly begins to leach the remaining heat from your own body. He has transitioned from a living, suffering companion into a solid block of freezing meat. You are wrapped tightly in a shroud of frozen wool that no longer bends or folds, a rigid carapace of dirty fabric that traps the stench of your own slow decay against your skin. The blanket is heavy with days of accumulated frozen condensation from your breath. Its coarse fibers fuse together into a solid, unyielding board. When you shift your weight on the hard permafrost of the cave floor, the fabric cracks with a sharp, terrifying sound that echoes like a snapping bone in the suffocatingly small space. You are trapped in a geography of absolute terror, a claustrophobic hole dug out of an avalanche path, miles above the breathable world. The darkness is not merely an absence of light. It is a heavy, physical substance that presses against your bruised eyelids, filling your nose and mouth with the sharp, metallic odor of dead air and gangrene. The dead guide, still positioned directly against your left side, has become an inanimate architectural feature of the cave, a solid block of freezing meat that constantly leaches the microscopic remnants of warmth from your shivering hip. You do not move away from him. Moving requires calories, and your body has already consumed every spare ounce of fat and muscle tissue you possess. You simply endure the horrific proximity of the corpse, your mind fractured by extreme hypoxia, actively trying to forget that the frozen object pressing against your ribs used to be a breathing human being. The paranoia settles in slowly, a creeping, insidious venom that infects the stagnant air of the snow cave. It starts with the eyes. There is only one other survivor left besides you and your husband, a man who was once a sturdy, capable packer, now reduced to a gaunt, shivering specter huddled in the corner. In the faint, sickly gray light that bleeds through the compacted snow of the entrance during the daylight hours, you can see his eyes. They are wide, utterly vacant, and entirely predatory. He does not look at the ceiling, or the dead man, or the entrance. He looks only at you. He watches the slow, ragged rise and fall of your chest with an animalistic intensity that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. You realize, with a cold, sickening jolt of pure primate terror, that the social contract of civilization has completely evaporated in this freezing void. There are no laws here, no morality, no royal societies or mathematical equations. There is only starving meat. You pull your rigid, frozen blanket tighter around your shoulders, your numb fingers curling into weak, defensive fists. Every time the man shifts his weight, the crunch of his boots on the ice sounds like the drawing of a knife. You stop sleeping entirely. You force your heavy, stinging eyelids open, staring back into the gloom, trapped in a silent, agonizing standoff driven purely by the horrific mechanics of starvation.
You slowly turn your stiff, aching neck to look at your husband. The man who dragged you into the sky to map the stars is effectively gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollowed-out husk of dying tissue. The frostbite that began as a waxy yellow pallor on his cheeks has progressed to a deep, necrotic black. The flesh of his nose, his lips, and the tips of his ears is dead, petrified by the freezing temperatures before his heart has even stopped beating. You watch the slow, agonizing struggle of his breathing. His chest barely moves, rising in microscopic, jerky increments before collapsing with a wet, rattling wheeze that vibrates through the packed ice of the floor. His eyes are half open, but the corneas are glazed and milky, staring blindly at the frost-covered wall inches from his face. He no longer mutters the frantic, disjointed astronomical data. The mathematical obsession that fueled his entire existence has been violently silenced by the mountain. You look at him, the man you legally bound yourself to, the man whose arrogant ambition sealed your fate in this frozen tomb, and you feel a terrifying, bottomless emptiness. There is no grief, there is no pity. There is only a stark, calculating observation of his failing biology. You are watching a machine slowly run out of fuel, waiting for the inevitable moment when the final gear grinds to a halt. It is during this agonizing vigil, as the paranoia and the silence threaten to crush your skull inward, that your right hand, blindly scraping against the frozen dirt and ice of the floor, brushes against something hard and distinct. It is not a rock. It is a thick, charred splinter of wood, likely a broken piece of a wooden crate that was pulverized in the avalanche and briefly, hopelessly set alight before the wind snuffed it out. You grip it with your numb, clumsy fingers. The texture is rough and powdery. It feels exactly like the raw chunks of carbon you spent hours grinding in that sweltering, heavily perfumed study in London a lifetime ago. The tactile memory triggers a violent, sudden short circuit in your starved brain. Your other hand frantically searches the debris around your knees, tearing at the frozen dirt until your bleeding fingernails hook onto a scrap of heavy, oil-treated canvas, a torn remnant of the destroyed observatory tent. You drag the stiff fabric onto your lap, spreading it over your frozen thighs. You press the charred splinter of wood against the rough canvas. The sound of the charcoal scratching against the fabric is deafening in the heavy silence of the cave. It is a harsh, rhythmic scritch-scritch that immediately draws the hollow, predatory gaze of the other survivor. You do not care. A manic, feverish energy suddenly floods your dying system, a desperate, hysterical need to impose order on this chaotic, freezing hell. You begin to draw. You press the charred wood down so hard it nearly snaps in your weak grip, leaving a thick black line across the yellowed canvas. You draw a ridge. You draw a valley. You are not mapping the stars. The stars have betrayed you, remaining cold, distant, and utterly indifferent to your suffering. You are mapping an escape. You draw jagged contour lines, creating a fictional geography where the sheer, unscalable granite walls of the Andes suddenly give way to gentle, sloping descents. You shade in deep ravines and carve out safe, manageable passes through the deadly shale. Your frostbitten hand moves with a frantic, terrifying speed, possessed by the ghost of your husband's obsession, channeling his meticulous need to chart the unchartable into a desperate delusion of survival. The obsession consumes you completely. You forget the burning agony in your collapsed stomach. You forget the solid block of the dead guide leaning against your hip. You forget the suffocating lack of oxygen. The torn scrap of canvas becomes your entire universe. You draw meticulously detailed topographical features, calculating imaginary elevations and plotting the safest routes away from the avalanche zone. You draw a winding path that leads down through the blinding white snowfields, past the shattered corpses of the mules, down to the green, humid valleys where the air is thick and the hearths are warm. You mark a spot on the canvas with a heavy black cross. Water. You draw a flowing river untouched by the ice, imagining the painfully sweet taste of it washing the metallic grit from your throat. You draw a cluster of squares. A settlement. You are inventing a geography of salvation, meticulously constructing a lie with a piece of burnt wood and a scrap of garbage. The deeper you delve into the map, the more real it feels to your hallucinating brain. You can almost feel the warm draft of the lower altitudes. You can almost smell the roasting meat of the valley towns. You are charting a path out of the nightmare. And for a few manic hours, you truly believe that if you just finish the drawing, if you get the topographical lines exactly right, the mountain will simply open up and let you walk away. But the cold reality of the cave is an aggressive, inescapable predator. Your logical mind, the pragmatic, exhausted part of your brain that calculated the ounces of salted pork and packed the heavy brass instruments, knows that the map is a complete fabrication. It knows that directly outside the blocked entrance of the snow cave is a sheer 3,000-foot drop into a freezing abyss. It knows there are no gentle slopes, no flowing rivers, and absolutely no settlements for hundreds of miles. But you aggressively, violently suppress that knowledge. If you acknowledge the reality of your situation, if you stop drawing the fictional escape route, you will be forced to look at your husband's blackening, rotting face. You will be forced to acknowledge that you are going to die in this dark hole surrounded by corpses. The map is your only defense mechanism, a fragile, soot-stained shield against the crushing weight of the void. You lean closer to the canvas, your breath ghosting white in the gloom, and meticulously shade a series of false switchbacks down an imaginary cliff face. The other survivor shifts violently in the corner, a sudden, erratic movement that shatters your concentration. He lets out a low, wet cough that sounds like tearing paper. He is staring directly at the canvas on your lap. The paranoia violently surges back, a hot spike of adrenaline in your frozen chest. You immediately pull the stiff fabric tight against your chest, crossing your arms over it to hide the crude black lines. He wants the map. The thought is completely irrational, a product of severe starvation and fear, but it feels as real and solid as the ice walls. You are convinced he wants to steal your escape route, to take the safe passage you have so painstakingly invented and leave you behind to freeze. You bare your teeth in the dark, a silent, feral snarl, your blackened fingers gripping the edges of the canvas with a desperate territorial aggression. You are ready to kill him over a piece of torn fabric and charcoal lie. He coughs again, his head slumping forward against his knees, completely oblivious to your silent, violent rage. He is simply dying, but to your fractured mind, he is an enemy combatant in a war for non-existent geography. You slowly lower the canvas back to your knees, your heart hammering a weak, chaotic rhythm against your ribs. You press the charcoal down to mark another fictional landmark, but your hand is shaking too violently. The fixed splinter of burnt wood snaps with a sharp crack, the jagged edge slicing cleanly into the raw, frost-damaged skin of your palm. You do not feel the pain,
but you feel the sudden warm welling of blood. You stare at your hand in the dim light. The blood is sluggish, dark, and thick. You look down at the map, at the chaotic, desperate tangle of black lines representing your fictional salvation. You press your bleeding palm directly against the canvas. You drag your hand across the fabric, leaving a stark crimson smear across the imaginary contour lines. You use your thumb to deliberately press a heavy drop of blood onto the exact center of the map. You are here. You mark your location in the freezing hell with your own failing biology. The bright red stands out violently against the dull yellow canvas and the black soot, a stark, visceral anchor to the agonizing reality of your physical body.
The rhythm of your husband's breathing changes again. The wet, rattling wheezes become longer, more spaced out, separated by terrifying spans of absolute silence where you are certain his heart has finally stopped. You do not reach out to hold his hand. You do not whisper words of comfort into the suffocating dark. You simply pick up the remaining half of the charcoal splinter and resume drawing. You surround the bloody thumbprint with dense, impenetrable black lines, charting a massive, impassable mountain range that completely boxes in your location. The escape route slowly disappears beneath a frantic, chaotic scribbling of heavy soot. You are no longer drawing a way out. The mania has broken, leaving behind a cold, heavy resignation. You are meticulously charting the exact coordinates of your own tomb. You are mapping the geography of fear, locking yourself inside the jagged black lines, entirely alone in the dark as the man beside you takes a long, agonizingly slow breath and fails to take another. The rhythm of the freezing dark is broken not by a sound, but by an absence. For days, the ragged, wet scraping of your husband's failing lungs has been the metronome of your shared misery, a mechanical, desperate pull of thin air that vibrated through the compacted ice of the cave floor. Now the vibration simply stops. You do not immediately react. Your brain, sluggish and starved of oxygen, requires several long, agonizing seconds to process the sudden void in the auditory landscape. You lie perfectly still, the frozen, coarse wool of your blanket digging sharply into your cheek, and you wait for the next rattling wheeze. You count the seconds in the pitch black. 10, 20, a minute. The silence stretches out, becoming heavy and dense, a physical pressure that pushes against your eardrums. You slowly turn your head, the vertebrae in your neck grinding with a sickening, dry friction. You reach out a heavy, numb hand in the dark. Your stiff fingers brush against the coarse fabric of his coat, moving upward until they find the rigid, icy line of his jaw. There is no pulse. There is no faint puff of warmth against your knuckles. The flesh is completely devoid of the microscopic kinetic energy of life. He has not slipped peacefully into the void. His body has simply run out of the caloric fuel required to keep the machinery running in this extreme, hostile environment. You do not scream. The peak of your suffering does not manifest in a violent, theatrical display of grief. A scream requires a massive expenditure of oxygen and energy, a luxury you absolutely do not possess. Instead, the realization hits you with a heavy, suffocating weight, a cold lead block dropping directly into the pit of your collapsed stomach. You shift your body closer to his, the frozen fabric of your skirts tearing loudly against the permafrost. You take his right hand in yours. The fingers are entirely blackened by necrosis, rigid and curled slightly inward like the dead claws of a frozen bird. It is the same hand that meticulously calibrated the brass gears of the massive telescope, the same hand that confidently drew the thick red line across the topographical maps in that stifling, heavily perfumed study in London. Now it is just freezing meat, rapidly equalizing with the ambient temperature of the ice cave. You grip his dead hand tightly, feeling the hard, unnatural stiffness of his joints. The man who dragged you to the edge of the world, driven by a cold, calculating obsession to map the ancient light of dead stars, has died in total, suffocating darkness, completely blind to the sky he worshipped.
A strange mechanical detachment settles over you, a profound psychological numbing that is a direct symptom of severe hypothermia and starvation. You let go of his rigid hand and slowly reach up to touch his face. The faint, sickly gray light bleeding through the blocked entrance of the cave offers just enough illumination to see the stark, horrific ruin of his features. You extend your index finger, the nail cracked and caked with dried blood, and you begin to trace the lines of his face. You are mapping him. It is a slow, methodical, entirely silent process. You run your numb fingertip along the sharp ridge of his brow bone, feeling the hard skull just beneath the thin, frozen tissue. You trace the deep, sunken hollows of his eye sockets, navigating them like deep, impassable craters on a desolate lunar surface. The necrotic flesh of his nose is hard and waxy, a steep, dangerous ridge that drops off into the frozen, cracked lines of his lips. You are charting the geography of his death, translating the horrific reality of his corpse into the cold, manageable data he always preferred. Every feature you touch brings a flood of disjointed, feverish memories that flash behind your eyes, violently juxtaposing the freezing reality of the cave with the warmth of a life that no longer exists. You trace the sharp line of his jaw, and you suddenly smell the pungent, cloying stench of melting beeswax and iron gall ink. You touch his freezing cheek, and you feel the sweltering, oppressive heat of the roaring brick hearth in London baking the sweat into your woolen skirts. The memories are not a comfort. They are a psychological torture, a sharp, localized agony that contrasts brutally with the dead, silent meat beneath your fingers. You are mapping a man who is already gone, charting a territory that has been completely conquered by the mountain. You trace the deep, frost-bitten fissures around his mouth, imagining them as contour lines indicating a sheer, unscalable drop. You press your thumb against his cold forehead, marking the exact elevation of his arrogant ambition, the precise altitude where his obsession finally killed him. You spend hours engaged in this macabre cartography, your mind completely disconnected from the horror of the act, driven purely by a primal, desperate need to establish order in a space defined by absolute, violent chaos. In the opposite corner of the cramped, freezing hole, the only other living entity in your universe shifts. It is a slow, agonizing slide of heavy wool against packed ice. You stop tracing your husband's dead face and turn your head. The last surviving expedition packer slumped against the curved wall, his chin resting heavily on his chest. For days you have been locked in a terrifying, silent standoff with this man, your paranoid, starved brain convinced he was a predator waiting for you to die so he could consume you. Now, looking at him through the gloom, the paranoia evaporates, leaving only a stark clinical observation of his imminent biological failure. His violent shivering has stopped entirely. His breathing is no longer a continuous cycle, but a series of desperate, shallow gasps separated by terrifyingly long intervals of silence. He is in the final, rapid stage of hypothermic collapse. The blood has entirely abandoned his extremities, pooling sluggishly around his failing heart and lungs in a last, futile attempt to protect his core. His eyes are open, staring blankly at the frost-covered floor between your boots. They are no longer predatory. They are simply empty, the complex electrical firing of his consciousness already shutting down in the severe cold. You watch him die with the same cold, mechanical detachment you used to map your husband's corpse. There is no impulse to crawl over the uneven ice to comfort him. There is no desire to hold his hand or offer a whispered prayer. You simply watch the slow, mechanical process of a human engine seizing up. He takes a breath, a wet, rattling sound that seems to tear through the thin, fibrous tissue of his lungs. He exhales, a long, drawn-out sigh that briefly fogs the freezing air in front of his face. Then the machinery stops. He does not take another breath. His jaw slowly falls open, completely slack, his chin resting heavily against his chest. His eyes remain fixed on the ice, unblinking, the corneas beginning to glaze over almost instantly in the sub-zero air. The final companion, the last piece of living, breathing evidence that the grand expedition ever existed, has been violently erased. He is now just another piece of heavy, freezing debris in the avalanche path. The silence that follows his death is not merely an absence of noise. It is a heavy physical substance that instantly floods the small cave. It is an absolute crushing weight that presses inward from the frozen walls, filling your lungs, your ears, and the hollow, burning cavern of your stomach. For the first time since the avalanche buried you alive, you are the only object generating heat in the darkness. You are entirely, profoundly alone. You are sharing a space no larger than a root cellar with 3 solidifying corpses, thousands of miles from civilization, buried under tons of compacted snow. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of your isolation is terrifying. There is no one left to listen to your ragged breathing. There is no one left to watch you freeze. If you scream now, the sound will simply be absorbed by the dead, unyielding ice, completely unheard by anyone or anything in the universe. You slowly pull your numb hand away from your husband's face. You retreat back into your rigid fetal position, pulling the stiff, dirty wool of your blanket tightly over your head, enclosing yourself in an even smaller, darker space. You close your eyes, but the darkness behind your eyelids is identical to the darkness of the cave. The mountain has won. It has systematically stripped away the heavy canvas, the brass instruments, the pack mules, and the men. It has reduced the grand, arrogant mission of charting the stars to a single starving woman shivering violently in a dark hole. You do not think about rescue. The concept of rescue is an absurd, illogical mathematics in this environment. You simply lie there, listening to the frantic, muffled thumping of your own failing heart, a pathetic drumbeat against the unyielding ice. You are the last surviving coordinate on a map entirely defined by death, waiting in the heavy, suffocating silence for the cold to finish its final, meticulous calculation.
You do not make a conscious decision to leave. The cognitive functions required for complex planning or emotional resolution have completely frozen. Instead, it is a sudden, violent rebellion of your basal ganglia, a primitive, animalistic reflex triggered by the absolute, crushing silence of the 3 corpses surrounding you. The air in the snow cave has become toxic, thick with the chemical odor of human putrefaction and expelled carbon dioxide. Your body knows that if you take one more breath of this stagnant, dead air, your heart will simply stop. You force your right arm to move. The coarse, frozen wool of your blanket has fused to your coat, and as you push outward, the fabric violently tears with a sound like ripping sheet metal. The physical pain of unbending your knees is nauseating. Your joints have been locked in a rigid, fetal position for days, the synovial fluid within them thickening into a sluggish, freezing gel. As you straighten your legs, your kneecaps grind audibly against the femur, sending bright, white-hot flares of agony shooting up your spine. You do not gasp. You cannot afford the oxygen. You simply grit your teeth until you taste the familiar, hot copper of blood from your own gums, and you begin to drag your useless, deadened legs across the permafrost. You must crawl over the dead guide to reach the entrance. There is no room to maneuver around him in the dark. You pull yourself forward, your raw, bleeding hands gripping the heavy, frozen fabric of his coat. He feels exactly like a fallen log, completely rigid and impossibly heavy. You drag your bruised stomach over his chest, your face inches from his open, glazed eyes. You feel absolutely nothing. The social taboos of handling the dead have been entirely burned away by the starvation. He is simply an obstacle, a piece of geographical debris you must traverse. You reach the heavy leather pack saddle that blocks the narrow tunnel. It is frozen solid into the surrounding snowpack, acting as a massive, immovable plug. You wedge your numb, blackened fingers into the tiny gap between the leather and the ice, and you push. Your muscles scream, the atrophied fibers tearing under the sudden strain. You throw your entire emaciated body weight against the saddle, over and over, battering your own shoulder against the frozen leather until you hear a sharp structural crack. The ice breaks. You shove the saddle outward, and the Andean night violently rushes in. The air outside is not just cold, it is a physical, abrasive force. It hits your face like a spray of fine, pulverized glass, instantly searing your lungs and forcing a ragged, wet cough from your chest. You drag yourself out of the tunnel, your elbows scraping raw against the compacted snow, and collapse onto the flat, blindingly white crust of the avalanche debris. You are out of the tomb. You roll onto your back, your chest heaving desperately, and you look up. The sky is an aggressive, terrifying canopy of absolute hostility. There is no moon, but the stars are so dense, so violently bright in the thin, moistureless atmosphere that they cast sharp, black shadows across the ice. They do not twinkle. They are hard, piercing, unblinking points of radiation, staring down at you with cold, mathematical indifference. These are the exact constellations your husband traded his life to measure. You look at the Southern Cross, burning like a branding iron in the black velvet void, and you feel a surge of pure, acidic hatred. The grand, noble pursuit of science was a lie. The sky is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a massive, crushing weight that actively hates you. You must stand. To remain on the ice is to freeze to the surface within minutes. You roll onto your stomach and plant your raw, bleeding hands onto the snow crust. You push your upper body up, your arms trembling so violently they threaten to give out entirely. You drag your right knee forward, then your left. You are a broken mechanism trying to force its gears to turn. You slowly heave yourself upright, using a jagged, heavy piece of slate protruding from the snow to steady your swaying frame. The sudden change in elevation triggers a massive, nauseating wave of vertigo. The world violently tilts, the field of stars spinning sickeningly above you as the thin, starved blood rushes away from your brain. You squeeze your eyes shut and lock your knees, waiting for the dark spots to clear. When you open your eyes, you look down at your boots. They are unrecognizable lumps of dirty, frozen leather. You have no feeling below your mid-calves. Your lower legs are completely dead, heavy blocks of petrified wood attached to your knees. You cannot feel the ground. You must rely entirely on the visual confirmation of your feet hitting the snow. You pick a direction. You do not consult the imaginary blood-stained map you drew in the cave. That delusion has been abandoned. You simply look at the slope of the mountain and you choose gravity. Down. You must go down. You lift your right leg from the hip, swinging it forward like a heavy pendulum. Your boot strikes the compacted snow with a dull, flat crunch. You shift your weight, relying entirely on the structural integrity of your locked bones rather than any muscular control, and you swing your left leg forward. Crunch. You take another step. Crunch. The descent begins. It is a slow, agonizing, mechanical gait. You are not walking. You are orchestrating a series of controlled falls, catching yourself with the dead weight of your own legs just before you pitch forward into the snow. The silence of the night is absolute, broken only by the harsh, rhythmic sound of your boots breaking the crust and the wet, ragged rasp of your own breathing. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. It becomes a hypnotic, endless loop. As the hours bleed into the dark, the severe hypoxia and the rhythmic, repetitive motion push your fractured mind into a deep, waking trance.
The boundary between the frozen earth and the night sky slowly begins to dissolve. The surface of the snow is polished to a glass-like sheen by the wind, perfectly reflecting the violent brilliance of the stars above. When you look down at your boots, you do not see ice. You see the cosmos. You are walking on the stars. Every time you slam your dead foot down, you are crushing a constellation beneath your heel. You step on Orion's belt. You drag your frozen toes through the heavy, glowing dust of the Milky Way. The hallucination is not a comfort. It is a terrifying, disorienting distortion of reality. You have lost all sense of up and down, suspended in an infinite, freezing sphere of black and white. Your universe shrinks entirely to the 3 feet of space immediately in front of you. There is no past. There is no warm study in London. There is no dead husband in the ice cave behind you. There is only the next step. If you stop moving, the stars will swallow you. You fall. Your right boot catches on a hidden, jagged ridge of buried slate, and your unfeeling leg simply refuses to compensate. You pitch violently forward, your face slamming hard into the unforgiving crust of the ice. The impact is jarring, snapping your head back, but you feel no pain. The cold has effectively anesthetized your entire body. You lie there for a moment, your cheek pressed against the freezing surface, tasting the metallic tang of old blood in your mouth. The overwhelming, seductive urge to just close your eyes and let the mountain take you is a heavy physical weight pressing against the back of your skull. It would be so incredibly easy to stop, but the primitive, mechanical programming in your brainstem violently overrides the exhaustion. You push yourself up on your bleeding hands. You force your dead legs underneath you. You stand swaying in the starlight, a solitary, ragged phantom on the face of an indifferent mountain. You lock your knees. You swing your right leg forward. Crunch. You step on a star. You swing your left leg. Crunch. You continue the slow, blind march into the endless, freezing void, a machine constructed entirely of suffering, moving relentlessly toward a dawn you no longer believe exists. The machinery finally breaks. It is not a sudden, dramatic snapping of bone or a violent tear of muscle, but a quiet, absolute depletion of the fuel required to maintain forward momentum. You're attempting to swing your right leg forward for the 10,000th time, but the electrical signal from your motor cortex simply fails to reach the dead, frozen meat of your thigh. The heavy, block-like pendulum of your boot does not clear the crust of the snow. The toe catches solidly on a buried spine of jagged granite. You do not stumble. You simply pivot rigidly around the pivot point of your trapped foot. Your center of gravity, already precariously unstable in the thin atmosphere, shifts irrevocably past the point of recovery. The world tilts in a slow, sickening arc. You do not throw your hands out to break your fall. The primitive survival reflex that would normally protect your face has been completely suppressed by the deep systemic freezing of your nervous system. You fall forward like a felled timber, a heavy, rigid mass of frozen wool and dying tissue surrendering completely to the pull of the mountain. The impact is remarkably gentle. When your face strikes the compacted permafrost, there is no jarring shock, no bright flash of pain. The nerves in your cheeks, your forehead, and your jaw have been dead for hours, their synaptic pathways shattered by the sub-zero temperatures. You bounce slightly against the hard crust, a dull, heavy thud that barely registers in your sluggish consciousness, and then you are perfectly still. You are lying flat on your stomach, your arms pinned uselessly beneath your chest, your right leg still hooked awkwardly behind the rock that tripped you. The silence of the high Andes immediately rushes in to fill the space left by your cessation of movement. The rhythmic, mechanical crunch-drag of your boots is gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy stillness that presses down on your spine like a physical weight. You leave your eyes open, staring sideways across the vast, moonlit expanse of the snowfield. The ice crystals just inches from your pupil are razor-sharp, glittering with a cold, hostile luminescence.
You know with a distant, detached sort of logic that you must order your arms to push you up. You must initiate the sequence of standing, but the command never leaves your brain. The terrifying, exhaustive effort of lifting your own skull away from the ice is a mathematical impossibility. You wait for the familiar, agonizing spasms of your muscles, the violent, bone-rattling shivering that has racked your frame for days. You wait for your jaw to clench, for your teeth to chatter against each other until they chip. But the shivering never comes. This is not a reprieve, it is a catastrophic biological milestone. Your hypothalamus, the tiny, primitive thermostat in your brain that has been desperately burning through your muscle tissue to generate kinetic heat, has finally exhausted its reserves of glycogen. The furnace has completely run out of coal. The violent contractions cease, leaving your body in an eerie, terrifying state of total flaccidity. The sharp, burning agony in your collapsed stomach, the excruciating ache in your broken collarbone, the raw, bleeding friction of your blistered feet, it all simply evaporates. The pain is not healed, it is merely disconnected. The sensory cables have been cleanly severed by the cold. You are floating in a bizarre, weightless purgatory, tethered to a body that you can no longer feel or control.
Then the mountain plays its final, most horrific trick. It begins as a faint, microscopic prickling deep within your chest cavity, right behind your sternum. It is a sensation so entirely alien to this environment that your fractured mind cannot immediately identify it. The prickling expands, blooming rapidly outward through your ribcage, down your arms, and deep into your frozen pelvis. It is heat. It is a sudden, shocking, and rapidly escalating wave of intense warmth. You do not know the medical terminology for what is happening to you. You do not know that the smooth muscles lining your peripheral blood vessels, completely exhausted by days of violent constriction, have suddenly and catastrophically failed. You do not know that the frigid, sluggish blood trapped in your extremities is suddenly rushing back into your core in a massive wave of terminal vasodilation. You only know that the agonizing, bitter cold of the Andes has abruptly vanished. The warmth is not subtle. It does not feel like a gentle thaw. It feels like someone has violently swung open the iron door of a roaring blast furnace directly in front of your face. The temperature in your core seems to spike dramatically, a phantom fever that burns with terrifying intensity. The memory of the stifling, oppressive London study suddenly bleeds into your physical reality. You can smell the pungent, melting beeswax. You can feel the heavy, baking heat of the brick hearth radiating against your skin, trapping the sweat beneath your heavy clothes. The frozen, rigid wool of your coat, the coarse blankets you have dragged across the ice, the damp, filthy undergarments, they are no longer a meager defense against the void. They are suddenly a suffocating, unbearable prison. You are burning alive from the inside out. A desperate claustrophobic panic seizes your mind. You must cool down. You must escape the boiling, oppressive heat before it cooks your internal organs. Your right arm, which moments ago was a dead, immovable log, suddenly jerks to life, fueled by the manic, hysterical energy of end-stage hypothermia. Your blackened, frost-bitten fingers, stiff as iron hooks, claw frantically at the high collar of your heavy wool coat. You cannot feel the fabric tearing the raw skin from your knuckles, nor can you feel the freezing air on your exposed throat. You only feel the desperate, overriding imperative to undress. You violently rip the heavy woolen scarf from your neck, tossing it away onto the ice. Your fingers fumble with the stiff, frozen buttons of your coat, slipping and sliding in a frantic lack of coordination. When the buttons refuse to yield, you simply hook your hands into the lapels and pull with a sudden, violent burst of adrenaline. The freezing thread snaps with a sharp series of pops, and the heavy coat falls open, exposing your damp, frozen undergarments directly to the -20-degree air.
The sub-zero wind sweeps across your bare chest, but your shattered nervous system registers it as a gentle, incredibly refreshing summer breeze. It is a magnificent, profound relief. The burning heat inside your chest begins to equalize, drawing you deeper into a state of absolute, delirious comfort. You do not stop with the coat. You roll clumsily onto your back, your movements jerky and uncoordinated, the rough ice scraping mercilessly against your exposed skin.
You tear at the heavy, frozen skirts, fighting the stiff layers of wool that bind your waist. You push the heavy fabric down past your hips, exposing your raw, frost-bitten thighs to the night. It is an act of pure survival-driven madness. The phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, a dying brain's complete misinterpretation of its environment. To any observer, you would look like a lunatic, violently stripping yourself naked on a glacier in the middle of the night. But from within your subjective reality, you are simply escaping a burning room. You are finally blissfully comfortable. You lie flat on your back, half naked on the permafrost, your arms spread wide out to your sides. The surface beneath you no longer feels like jagged, abrasive ice. The sensory distortion is complete. The snow feels incredibly soft, yielding perfectly to the contours of your broken body like a deep, luxurious feather mattress. The crushing, heavy burden of survival, the terrifying mathematics of calories and elevations, the obsessive need to map the escape route, it all detaches from your mind and simply blows away on the wind. The deep, animalistic terror that has driven you forward since the avalanche is entirely gone, replaced by a heavy, intoxicating lethargy. You feel a deep, resonant hum vibrating through your bones, a sensation of profound cellular relaxation. The mountain is no longer an enemy to be fought. It is a massive, silent bed, and you are finally being allowed to rest. You open your eyes wide, staring directly up into the terrifying density of the Andean night sky. The sheer, crushing scale of the cosmos, which had filled you with such absolute dread just an hour ago, completely shifts in its nature. The stars are no longer hard, unblinking points of hostile radiation. As your pupils dilate fully in the dark, the pinpricks of light begin to swell. The brilliant, glowing dust of the Milky Way seems to detach from the black velvet of the void, drifting slowly downward. The cold, mechanical geometry of the constellations, the harsh, rigid lines your husband spent his life trying to measure, begins to soften, to blur, to bend. The stars are expanding, their light bleeding outward, turning from a piercing, blinding white to a soft, warm, enveloping gold. They look like millions of floating embers drifting up from a massive, invisible hearth. You watch, completely mesmerized, as the Southern Cross seems to lower itself from the zenith. The 4 brilliant points of light grow massive, filling your entire field of vision. They are not falling to crush you, they are reaching down. The oppressive, infinite distance between the earth and the heavens collapses entirely. The sky is leaning in, a vast, glowing canopy of light pressing gently against your face. You feel an overwhelming, euphoric sense of connection, a sudden, beautiful realization that you are not dying alone in the dark, but simply dissolving back into the ancient, glowing dust of the universe. The hostility of the void was a lie. The stars are warm. They are welcoming. They have been waiting for you to stop fighting, waiting for you to finally lay down the heavy brass instruments and simply look at them. The thumping of your heart, which had been a frantic, desperate drumbeat against your ribs for days, begins to slow. It is no longer struggling. Thump, thump, thump. The intervals between the beats stretch out, becoming long, luxurious pauses in the dark. Your breathing slows to match it, no longer a ragged, wet gasp for non-existent oxygen, but a shallow, peaceful sigh. The golden light of the swollen stars fills your vision completely, burning away the blackness of the night, burning away the memory of the cold, burning away the faces of the dead men in the ice cave. There is only the light and the immense, heavy warmth spreading outward from your chest. You feel a smile pull at the corners of your cracked, frozen lips, a small, utterly peaceful expression that you cannot control. The heavy, protective shutters of your eyelids begin to droop, the sheer weight of the exhaustion finally pulling them down. You do not fight it. You welcome the dark. You take one final, slow, shallow breath of the freezing air, and as you slowly close your eyes, you surrender completely to the immense, crushing warmth of the ice, slipping quietly and permanently out of the world of the living. The transition from the peaceful golden void back to the brutal reality of the physical world does not begin with a gentle awakening. It begins with a violent, terrifying intrusion. The warm, expanding stars that had enveloped your dying consciousness are suddenly violently shattered, replaced by an aggressive, blinding red glare piercing straight through your closed eyelids. The heavy, beautiful silence of the mountain is ripped apart by a chaotic, grating assault of noise. It sounds like the roaring of a terrifying, unseen beast, a cacophony of harsh, guttural barking that vibrates painfully against your frozen eardrums. You do not realize, in your profoundly compromised state, that these are human voices. You do not recognize the frantic, exhausted shouts of the search party that has spent days combing the avalanche debris. To your starved, oxygen-deprived brain, the noise is simply another geological violence, a rock slide of sound threatening to crush the fragile peace you had finally achieved. You try to retreat, to sink back down into the soft, luxurious mattress of the permafrost, but the heavy, intoxicating lethargy is suddenly broken by the sharp, localized agony of physical contact. Rough, heavy hands grab your shoulders. The touch is completely devoid of comfort. It is a shocking, abrasive violation of your paralyzed body. You feel the sudden, jerky movement of being violently rolled onto your side, tearing the skin of your bare back away from the ice where it had begun to freeze solid. You try to scream, to demand that they leave you to the warm embrace of the dark, but your vocal cords are petrified, completely incapable of vibrating. All that escapes your cracked, bleeding lips is a wet, pathetic hiss. You are entirely helpless, a rigid mannequin of freezing meat being manhandled by unseen forces. They are wrapping you in something incredibly heavy and suffocating. It is thick, coarse animal hide, smelling sharply of wet fur, stale sweat, and grease. They pile layer upon layer over your exposed, frost-bitten skin, violently combating the paradoxical undressing that had brought you such euphoric relief. The sudden application of insulation does not feel warm. It feels like you are being buried alive all over again, the immense weight of the furs pressing down on your bruised, collapsed chest, triggering a massive, suffocating wave of claustrophobia. You were lifted from the ground. The sudden suspension in the air is a sickening, terrifying loss of gravity. You were thrown roughly over the broad, heavily muscled shoulder of a rescuer, your rigid torso folding at a painful, unnatural angle. Every massive, crunching step the man takes through the deep snow sends a concussive shockwave traveling directly up your spine, grinding your frozen vertebrae together. The mechanical, jarring rhythm of the descent begins. You are no longer the one walking the constellations. You are a piece of salvaged debris, a broken instrument being hauled back down the mountain. Your head dangles uselessly toward the ground, the blood rushing violently into your skull, creating a throbbing, localized pressure that threatens to burst your eyeballs from their sockets. You fade in and out of consciousness, caught in a nauseating loop of pitch-black oblivion and the agonizing, jarring reality of the man's shoulder driving into your shattered collarbone with every step. You do not feel grateful. You do not feel saved. You feel an intense, feral hatred for these men who have stolen your peaceful end and dragged you back into the mechanics of suffering. When the rhythmic bouncing finally stops, you are dumped unceremoniously onto a hard, flat surface. The grating, animalistic noises of the man are louder now, echoing in a confined space. You are inside a tent, a lower-altitude base camp erected below the snowline. The air here is aggressively thick, heavily saturated with oxygen that practically burns your atrophied lungs as you take a shallow, rattling gasp. But it is not the air that constitutes the true nightmare. It is the heat. Someone has built a massive, roaring fire inside the shelter. The thermal radiation hits your frozen body like a physical blow, a sudden violent change in the ambient temperature that your shattered nervous system cannot process. This is the beginning of the violent thaw. The medical reality of severe hypothermia is that freezing to death is a quiet anesthetic surrender. Returning from the brink of that death is a spectacular, screaming agony. The blood, which had retreated entirely to your core to protect your vital organs, is suddenly triggered by the external heat to rush back into your deadened extremities. It does not flow smoothly. It violently forces its way through collapsed, brittle capillaries and damaged veins. The sensation is absolute, unadulterated torture. It feels exactly as if someone has hooked your veins to a pump and is forcing boiling, caustic acid directly into your bloodstream. The pain starts in the deep marrow of your bones and radiates outward, a searing, white-hot fire that consumes your arms and legs. You finally find your voice. A long, guttural shriek tears its way out of your raw throat, a sound so primal and horrified it silences the frantic shouting of the rescuers. You thrash violently against the heavy furs, your muscles spasming uncontrollably as the electrical pathways of your nervous system violently short-circuit under the sudden influx of blood. You are burning alive, trapped inside a body that is actively tearing itself apart as it attempts to restart. Someone pins your shoulders down, their heavy hands bruising the delicate thawing tissue. A hard metal rim is forced against your teeth, chipping the enamel, and a mouthful of scalding, heavily sweetened liquid is poured down your throat. You choke violently, sputtering and coughing up half of the hot tea, but the fraction that makes it into your collapsed stomach hits like a localized explosion. The sudden introduction of calories to an entirely starved digestive tract triggers a massive, violent cramp, a sharp, twisting agony that makes you curl into a tight, defensive ball, screaming until you taste the hot copper of fresh blood in the back of your throat. The men are rubbing your limbs, an archaic, brutal method of attempting to stimulate circulation. Every pass of their coarse woolen mittens over your frostbitten skin feels like being violently scrubbed with heavy grit sandpaper. They are literally peeling the dead, necrotizing top layers of your epidermis away, exposing the raw, screaming nerve endings beneath to the stifling heat of the tent. You open your eyes, your vision blurred with tears of pure physical agony. You look down at your hands protruding from the furs. They do not look human. The digits are swollen to twice their normal size, the skin taut, shiny, and stretched to the absolute breaking point. The tissue is a horrific, mottled canvas of deep, bruised purple and absolute necrotic black. Massive, fluid-filled blisters are rapidly forming across your knuckles and the backs of your palms, weeping a thin, yellowish serum. The visual confirmation of your own ruin sends a fresh wave of nausea crashing over you. You realize with a cold, terrifying clarity that cuts straight through the boiling pain of the thaw that the mountain did not let you go. It simply changed its method of execution. It has kept your fingers, your toes, the tip of your nose. It has claimed its toll in flesh. You are surviving, yes, but you are a butchered, ruined remnant of the woman who confidently packed those heavy canvas crates in London.
The psychological thaw is just as violent as the physical one. As the oxygen-rich air fuels your brain, the heavy anesthetic fog of the hypothermia rapidly burns away, leaving you completely exposed to the horrific reality of the past week. The memories, previously disjointed and muted by the cold, come rushing back with a terrifying high-definition clarity. You can suddenly smell the distinct metallic odor of the snow cave. You can feel the exact, rigid weight of the dead guide pressing against your left hip. You can hear the long, agonizingly slow silence that followed your husband's final rattling breath. The phantom weight of his dead, blackened hand in yours is so intensely real you violently jerk your own swollen fingers away, screaming hysterically at the empty air beside you. The rescuers mistake your psychological terror for physical pain, holding you down tighter, entirely ignorant of the fact that the true horror is not the boiling blood in your veins, but the inescapable permanent geography of the trauma settling into your mind. You survived the ice, but the silence, the dark, and the corpses are forever mapped onto the inside of your skull, a heavy, suffocating weight you will carry for the rest of your agonizing, resurrected life. You slowly raise your right hand from the lap of your heavy skirts to pull a woolen fold tighter across your throat. It is not a hand anymore.
It is a mangled, horrific claw of shiny, grafted tissue and brutal surgical amputations. You are missing the index and ring fingers entirely, the surgeon's bone saw having taken them at the knuckle in a desperate, bloody bid to stop the necrotic gangrene from consuming your entire arm. The remaining digits are curled inward, the joints fused solid by the massive tissue damage, the skin tight, purple, and agonizingly sensitive to the slightest change in air pressure. You look at this ruined appendage, illuminated by the harsh, flickering orange light of the coal fire, and you do not feel pity. You feel a cold, detached resignation. This hand is the physical receipt of your survival, the toll the mountain demanded in exchange for your life. Every time you attempt to hold a teacup or turn the page of a book or simply rest your hand against the arm of the chair, you are violently reminded of the exact texture of the freezing permafrost and the metallic, coppery scent of your own blood on the snow. The mountain did not let you go entirely. It kept the pieces of you it wanted, leaving you to drag this butchered remnant through the rest of your unnatural life. The parlor is completely silent, save for the aggressive popping hiss of the wet coal in the grate and the rhythmic heavy ticking of the massive grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. The sound is incredibly loud in the stagnant air. You close your eyes, and the ticking instantly warps and distorts in your traumatized mind. It is no longer a clock. It is the sharp, precise clicking of cold brass gears being meticulously calibrated by blackened, frost-bitten fingers. It is the sound of the surveyor's telescope locking into place to measure the indifferent void. You grip the wooden armrest of your chair with your ruined hand, your breath catching painfully in your scarred lungs. The air in the room suddenly feels dangerously thin, brittle, and devoid of oxygen. You force your eyes open, staring desperately at the familiar, safe floral pattern of the wallpaper, violently grounding yourself in the present reality. But the hallucination lingers at the edges of your vision, a sickly gray overlay of the canvas observatory tent superimposed over your Victorian parlor. You are 82 years old, sitting in the heart of the British Empire, but in your mind you are permanently tethered to that freezing, catastrophic peak. You do not allow maps in this house. The mere sight of a topographical line, a neat, charted grid of latitude and longitude, triggers a visceral biological panic that you cannot control. Years ago, a well-meaning nephew brought a newspaper into the parlor to show you the planned route of a new railway line through the countryside. As he unfolded the paper, exposing the black, jagged lines of the terrain, you violently vomited thin, sour bile directly onto the Persian rug. The brain's complete, absolute rejection of geography was instantaneous. You had meticulously drawn your own map once in the pitch-black, suffocating tomb of the snow cave, using a piece of charred wood and the blood from your own palm. You charted a desperate, fictional escape route while the corpses of your expedition solidified around you. To look at a map now is to instantly smell the putrefaction of the dead guide pressed against your hip. It is to feel the overwhelming, psychotic paranoia that the starving man in the corner is waiting to murder you for a torn scrap of canvas. All atlases, globes, and navigational charts have been violently purged from your existence. You live in a terrifying, deliberate geographical vacuum, refusing to acknowledge the shape of the world that almost swallowed you whole. The physical pain is a constant, droning background noise, but it is the phantom pain that truly drives the madness deep into your skull. You are missing 6 toes, cleanly amputated in a sweltering, screaming field hospital weeks after your rescue. Yet right now, as you sit by the baking fire, you can feel them. You can feel the exact excruciating sensation of the heavy leather boots freezing solid around those non-existent digits. You can feel the agonizing, grinding friction of the blistered, frost-bitten flesh rubbing against the coarse wool of your socks with every heavy, mechanical step you took during your blind descent down the mountain. The nerves that were severed decades ago are permanently locked in a loop of traumatic memory, endlessly transmitting the sensation of severe tissue death to a brain that cannot shut the signal off. When you are forced to walk across the room, relying heavily on a thick wooden cane, your gait is a slow, uneven shuffle. Thump, drag, thump, drag. To the maid, it is simply the tragic frailty of an old woman, but to you, every step perfectly mimics the desperate, synchronized rhythm of breaking through the crust of the avalanche debris. You are not walking across a polished floorboard. You are still executing that endless hypnotic loop of controlled falls, waiting for the snow to finally give way and drop you into the abyss.
You refuse to eat meat that has been salted or cured. The heavy, nauseating stench of preserved pork or hardened biscuit bread instantly transports you back to the grueling, sweltering preparations in London, where you blindly packed the instruments of your own demise. You subsist entirely on soft, warm broths and boiled vegetables, your stomach permanently shrunken and violently hostile to heavy digestion. The trauma has infected every mundane aspect of your daily survival. You cannot look at a glass of water if it contains ice. The sharp, clinking sound of the frozen cubes striking the crystal glass sounds exactly like the deep, structural groaning of the ancient glacier shifting beneath your feet, milliseconds before the avalanche tore the mountain apart. When the winter months arrive and the frost blooms thick and white across the parlor window panes, you lock yourself in your bedchamber with the curtains drawn tight, weeping silently into your pillow, terrified that the hoarfrost is creeping across the walls to seal you back into the suffocating dark of the snow cave. You are a prisoner of temperature, texture, and sound, completely held hostage by the sensory triggers of your own horrific past. As the long, oppressive afternoon finally begins to bleed into evening, a deep primal anxiety takes root in your chest. The fading of the light is not a gentle, peaceful transition. It is a terrifying countdown. On the mountain, the setting sun meant an instant, violent plunge into sub-zero temperatures. It meant the cessation of all forward movement. It meant the arrival of the screaming mechanical wind and the absolute pitch-black sensory deprivation of the ice. You watch the shadows stretch long and thin across the floorboards, reaching toward your rocking chair like dark, freezing fingers. You violently strike the small silver bell resting on the table beside you, hitting it with the heel of your ruined hand. The maid appears quickly, her face a mask of careful, practiced pity. You do not speak to her. You merely point a trembling, scarred stump toward the windows. She understands the silent, frantic command. She moves swiftly, pulling the heavy, dark velvet curtains tightly shut, meticulously ensuring that not a single sliver of the darkening sky can penetrate the room. She lights the oil lamps, bathing the parlor in a warm, artificial yellow glow. But the velvet is never thick enough. You know what is waiting just behind the glass. You lean back in the rocking chair, the rhythmic creaking of the wood sounding sickeningly like the straining leather saddles of the dying pack mules fighting for oxygen on the narrow, crumbling ledges. The silence of the house settles heavily around you, pressing inward. This is the time when the ghosts are the loudest. You close your heavy, stinging eyelids, desperately trying to block out the room, but the darkness behind your eyes offers absolutely no sanctuary. You are immediately back in the suffocatingly tight space of the snow cave. The smell of wet, rotting wool and gangrene hits you with physical force. You feel the heavy, rigid block of the dead guide's frozen torso pressing solidly against your left hip, leaching the heat from your bones. You slowly turn your head in the dark, and there he is, your husband. He is sitting in the empty armchair across the hearth, illuminated by the flickering firelight, but his face is a terrifying, necrotic ruin of black, waxy frostbite. His milky, glazed eyes stare blindly at the ceiling, his jaw moving in a continuous, silent, frantic recitation of the mathematical calculations that killed him. Right ascension, declination, azimuth. The words are a ghostly, silent static that vibrates in your hollow teeth.
He is completely unresponsive, permanently locked in the agonizing hours before his heart finally seized, and you are condemned to sit beside him and watch him die, over and over, every single night for the rest of your life. The heat of the room becomes oppressive, a suffocating, heavy blanket that suddenly triggers the most terrifying memory of all, the paradoxical thaw. You feel the phantom sensation of your core temperature violently spiking, the hallucinatory boiling heat that convinced you to strip yourself naked on the glacier in the dead of night. You grip the edges of your heavy shawls, your knuckles turning white, fighting the hysterical, manic urge to tear the wool from your shoulders and expose yourself to the air. You are caught in a violent internal war between the reality of the baking parlor and the powerful chemical delusion of end-stage hypothermia. Your breathing becomes shallow and ragged, a wet, rattling wheeze that perfectly mimics the death rattle of the men you left behind. You are suffocating on oxygen, drowning in the traumatic memory of the thin, abrasive air of the high altitudes. You rock faster and faster, the chair groaning in protest, trying to outrun the phantom heat, trying to physically shake the hallucination from your fracturing mind. Suddenly, a heavy gust of summer wind rattles the window frame. The draft catches the edge of the heavy velvet curtain, pulling it back just a fraction of an inch from the glass. Your eyes snap open, drawn involuntarily to the narrow vertical slit of exposed night. Through the gap, suspended in the polluted, hazy blackness of the London sky, you see it. A single, solitary star. It is not twinkling with romantic beauty. It is a hard, piercing, unblinking point of hostile radiation. It punches through the glass, through the stifling heat of the room, and stabs directly into your retinas. The vertigo hits you with the force of a physical blow. The floorboards beneath your chair seem to vanish, the walls of the parlor dissolve, and you are suddenly falling upward into the freezing, infinite, crushing depth of the cosmos. The sheer scale of the universe, the terrifying density of the void presses down on your chest, instantly reducing you back to a microscopic, starving parasite clinging to a vertical wall of dead gray rock.
You stare at that single point of light, the tears finally welling in your eyes, hot and thick. It is not a map. It is not a destination. It is a massive, glittering graveyard. You see the faces of the indigenous guides, their skin bruised blue, their mouths packed solidly with ice. You see the hollow, predatory eyes of the starving packer watching you in the dark. You see your husband, his rigid, blackened hand reaching forever toward a sky that aggressively hated him. The grand expedition, the beautiful brass telescope, the meticulous calculations, they were all utterly meaningless against the brutal, violent mechanics of the mountain. You survived the ice, you survived the violent, agonizing thaw, and you survived the decades of haunting. But you know the absolute, terrifying truth. You never actually walked down from the Andes. Your body was dragged away by the rescue party, but your soul, your mind, and your terror were permanently frozen into the permafrost at 10,000 feet. You slowly reach out your ruined, amputated hand and pull the heavy velvet curtain tightly shut, sealing yourself back into the hot, suffocating dark. You lean your head back against the rocking chair, listening to the ticking of the brass gears, waiting in the heavy silence for the cold to finally, mercifully finish its work.